20 feet, 37 m, in 12 seconds, was recorded in a famous photograph. In the fourth flight of the same day, Wilbur Wright flew 852 feet, 260 m, in 59 seconds. Modern analysis by Professor Fred E. C. Kulik and Henry R. Rex, 1985, has demonstrated that the 1903 Wright Flyer was so unstable as to be almost unmanageable by anyone but the Wrights, who had trained it themselves in the 1902 Glider. 110. The Wrights continued developing their flying machines and flying at Huffman Prairie near Dayton, Ohio in 1904-05. After a crash in 1905, they rebuilt the Flyer 3 and made important design changes. They almost doubled the size of the elevator and rudder and moved them about twice the distance from Fewings. They added 2 fixed vertical vanes, called blinkers, between the elevators, and gave the wings a very slight dihedral. They disconnected the rudder from the wing warping control, and as in all future aircraft, placed it on a separate control handle. The Flyer 3 became the first practical aircraft, though without wheels and using a launching device, flying consistently under full control and bringing its pilot back to the starting point safely and landing without damage. On the 5th of October, 1905, Wilbur flew 24 miles, 39 kilometers, in 39 minutes 23 seconds. 111. Eventually the Wrights would abandon the 4-plane altogether, with the Model B of 1910 instead having a tailplane in the manner which was by then becoming conventional. According to the April 1907 issue of the Scientific American magazine, 112, the Wright brothers seemed to have the most advanced knowledge of heavier-than-air navigation at the time. However, the same magazine issue also claimed that no public flight had been made in the United States before its April 1907 issue. Hence, they devised the Scientific American Aeronautic Trophy in order to encourage the development of a heavier-than-air flying machine. The first practical aircraft. Once powered, controlled flight had been achieved, progress was still needed to create a practical flying machine for general use. This period leading up to World War I is sometimes called the pioneer era of aviation. 113, 114, reliable power. The history of early powered flight is very much the history of early engine construction. The Wrights designed their own engines. They used a single flight engine, a 12 horsepower, 8.9 kilowatts, water-cooled 4-cylinder inline type with 5 main bearings and fuel injection. Whitehead's craft was powered by 2 engines of his design, a ground engine of 10 horsepower, 7.5 kilowatts, which drove the front wheels in an effort to reach takeoff speed, and a 20 horsepower, 15 kilowatts, acetylene engine powering the propellers. Whitehead was an experienced machinist, and he is reported to have raised funds for his aircraft by making and selling engines to other aviators. 115. Most early engines were neither powerful nor reliable enough for practical use, and the development of improved engines went hand in hand with improvements in the airframes themselves. In Europe, Leon Levavasseur's Antoinette 8V pioneering example of the V8 engine format, first patented in 1902, dominated flight for several years after it was introduced in 1906, powering many notable craft of that era. Incorporating direct fuel injection, evaporative water cooling and other advanced features, it generated around 50 horsepower, 37 kilowatts. The British Green C.4 of 1908 followed the Wrights' pattern of a 4-cylinder inline water-cooled design but produced 52 horsepower, 39 kilowatts. It powered many successful pioneer aircraft, including those of a V. Roe. Horizontally opposed designs were also produced. The 4-cylinder water-cooled de Havilland Iris achieved 45 horsepower, 34 kilowatts, but was little used, while the successful two-cylinder Newport Designar Shive 28 HP, 21 kilowatts, in 1910.1909 saw radial engine forms rise to significance. The Anzani three-cylinder semi-radial or fan engine of 1909, also built in a true 120-degree cylinder angle radial form, developed only 25 horsepower, 19 kilowatts, but was much lighter than the Antoinette, and was chosen by Louis Blériot for his cross-channel flight. More radical was Seguin Brothers series of Gnome rotary radial engines, starring with the Gnome Omega 50 horsepower, 37 kilowatts, air-cooled 7-cylinder rotary engine in 1906. In a rotary engine, the crankshaft is fixed to the airframe and the whole engine casing and cylinders rotate with the propeller. Although this type had been introduced as long ago as 1887 by Lawrence Hargrave, improvements made to the Gnome created a robust, relatively reliable and lightweight design which revolutionized aviation and would see continuous development over the next 10 years. Fuel was introduced into each cylinder direct from the crankcase, meaning that only an exhaust valve was required. The larger and more powerful 9-cylinder, 80-horsepower Lerone 9C rotary was introduced in 1913 and was widely adopted for military use. Inline and V-types remained popular, with the German company Mercedes producing a series of water-cooled 6-cylinder models. In 1913, they introduced the highly successful 75 kilowatts, 101 HP, D.I series. Lift and efficiency. The lightness and strength of the biplane is offset by the inefficiency inherent in placing two wings so close together. Biplane and monoplane designs vied with each other, with both still in production by the outbreak of war in 1914. A notable development, although a failure, was the first cantilever monoplane ever built. The Antoinette monoblock of 1911 had a fully enclosed cockpit and faired undercarriage, but its V8 engine's 50 horsepower, 37 kilowatts, output was not enough for it to fly for more than a few feet at most. More successful was the Dipodus braced monoplane, which won the inaugural 1913 Schneider Trophy race flown by Maurice Prevost, completing 28 circuits of the 10 kilometers, 6.2 mi, course with an average speed of 73.63 kilometers per hour, 45.75 miles per hour. Triplanes too were experimented with, notably a series built between 1909 and 1910 by the British pioneer A.V. Roe. Going one better with four wings, the quadruplane too made rare appearances. The multiplane, having large numbers of very thin wings, was also experimented with, most successfully by Horatio Phillips. His final prototype confirmed the inefficiency and poor performance of the idea. Other radical approaches to wing design were also being tried. The Scottish-born inventor Alexander Graham Bell devised a cellular octahedral wing form which, like the multiplane, proved disappointingly inefficient. Other lackluster performers included the Edwards rhomboidal, the Lee Richards annular wing, and varying numbers of wings one after the other in tandem. Many of these early experimental forms were in principle quite practical and have since reappeared. Stability and control. Early work had focused primarily on making a craft stable enough to fly but failed to offer full controllability, while the Wrights had sacrificed stability in order to make their flyer fully controllable. A practical aircraft requires both. Although stability had been achieved by several designs, the principles were not fully understood and progress was erratic. The aileron slowly replaced wing warping for lateral control. Old Hauff designers sometimes, as with the Blériot 11, returned briefly to wing warping. Similarly, all flying tail surfaces gave way to fixed stabilizers with hinged control surfaces attached. The canard pusher configuration of the early Wright Flyers was supplanted by tractor propeller aircraft designs. In France, progress was relatively rapid. The Santos Dumont 14 bis in its final configuration, after the ailerons were added. On the 23rd of October and the 12th of November, 1906, the Brazilian Alberto Santos Dumont made public flights in France with his 14 bis. 116, a canard pusher biplane with pronounced wing dihedral. It had a Hargrave-style box cell wing with a forward-mounted box kite assembly which was movable to act as both elevator and rudder. His flight was the first made by a powered heavier-than-air machine to be verified by the Aero Club de France, and won the Deutsche Archdeacon Prize for the first officially observed flight of more than 25 meters, 82 feet. It later set the first world record recognized by the Fédération Aéronautique Internationale by flying 220 meters, 720 feet, in 21.5 seconds. 117, 118. It had no lateral control, so after the flights, in late November, he added auxiliary surfaces between wings as primitive ailerons, and made a few more flights. 119. The next year Louis Blériot flew the Blériot 7, a tractor monoplane with full 3-axis control using the horizontal tail surfaces as combined elevators and ailerons. Its immediate descendant, the Blériot 8, Wade's very first airframe to bring together the recognizable elements of the modern aircraft flight control system in April 1908. 120, where Horatio Phillips and Trienveur had failed, Blériot was the first practical tractor monoplane and marked the start of a trend in French aviation. By 1909, he had developed his configuration to the point where the Blériot 11 was able to cross the English Channel, among other refinements, using the tail surfaces only as elevators and using wing warping for lateral control. Another design that appeared in 1907 was the Voisin biplane. This lacked any provision for lateral control, and could only make shallow turns using only rudder control, but was flown with increasing success during the year by Henry Farman, and on the 13th of January, 1908 he won the 50,000 francs Deutsche de l'Armure Archdeacon Grand Prix de l'Aviation for being the first aviator to complete an officially observed 1-kilometer closed-circuit flight, including taking off and landing under the aircraft's own power. The designs of the French pioneer Léon Levavasseur are better known by the name of the Antoinette Company, which he founded. His Antoinette 4 of 1908 was a monoplane of what is now the conventional configuration, with tailplane and fin each bearing movable control surfaces, and ailerons on the wings. The ailerons were not sufficiently effective and on later models were replaced by wing warping. At the end of 1908, the Voisin brothers sold an aircraft ordered by Henry Farman to J.T. Seymour Brabazon. Angered, Farman built his own aircraft, adapting the Voisin design by adding ailerons. Following further modifications to the tail surfaces and ailerons, the Farman 3 became the most popular aeroplane sold between 1909 and 1911, and was widely imitated. In Britain, the American expatriate Samuel Cody flew an aircraft similar in layout to the Wright Flyer in 1908, incorporating a tailplane as well as a large front elevator. In 1910, an improved model fitted with between-wing ailerons won the Michelin Cup competition, while Geoffrey de Havilland's second Farman-style aircraft had ailerons on the upper wing and became the Royal Aircraft Factory F.E.1. The Bristol box kite, a copy of the Farman 3, was manufactured in quantity. In the USA, Glenn Curtiss had flown first the AEA Junebug and then his Golden Flyer, which in 1910 achieved the first naval deck landing and takeoff. Meanwhile, the the Wrights themselves had also been wrestling with the problem of achieving both stability and control, experimenting further with foreplane before first adding a second small plane at the tail and then finally removing the foreplane altogether. They announced their two-seat Model B in 1910 and licensed it for production in 1911 as the Burgess Model F. Many other more radical layouts were tried, with only a few showing any promise. In the United Kingdom, J.W. Dunn developed a series of tailless pusher designs having swept wings with a conical upper surface. His D.5 biplane flew in 1910 and proved fully stable. Dunn deliberately avoided full three-axis control, devising instead a system which was easier to operate and which he regarded as far safer in practice. Dunn's system would not be widely adopted. His tailless design reached its peak with the D.8, which was manufactured under license in France by Newport and in the US as the Burgess Dunn. However, it was rejected as a practical warplane by the British Army, in which Dunn was an officer, because it was too stable and hence not maneuverable enough in battle. Seaplanes. Henry Fabre on his Hydravion. 1901 in Austria, Wilhelm Kress fails to take off in his underpowered Drachenflieger, a float plane featuring twin pontoons made of aluminium and three wings in tandem. 1910 in France, Henry Fabre makes the first seaplane flight in his Hydravion. 121. It was a monoplane with a biplane, foreplane and three short floats in tricycle layout. 1912 The world's first seaplane carrier, the French Navy's Foudre, embarks her first float plane, 122, of Razon Canard. A problem with early seaplanes was the tendency for suction between the water and the aircraft as speed increased, holding the aircraft down and hindering takeoff. The British designer John Cyril Portet invented a technique of placing a step in the bottom of the aircraft to break the suction, and this was incorporated in the 1914 Curtiss Model H. Military use. In 1909, aeroplanes remained frail and of little practical use. The limited engine power available meant that effective payload was extremely limited. The basic structural and materials technology of the airframe mostly consisted of hardwood materials or steel tubing, braced with steel wires and covered in linen fabric doped with a flammable stiffener and sealant. 123. The need to save weight meant that most aircraft were structurally fragile, and not infrequently broke up in flight, especially when performing violent maneuvers such as pulling out of a steep dive, which would be required in combat. Even so, these evolving flying machines were recognized to be not just toys, but weapons in the making. In 1909, the Italian staff officer Giulio Douhet remarked, "The sky is about to become another battlefield no less important than the battlefields on land and sea. In order to conquer the air, it is necessary to deprive the enemy of all means of fleeing, by striking at him in the air, at his bases of operation, or at his production centers. We had better get accustomed to this idea, and prepare ourselves." Giulio Douhet, Italian staff officer, 1909, 123. In 1911, Captain Bertram Dixon, the first British military officer to fly and the first British military officer to perform an aerial reconnaissance mission in a fixed-wing aircraft during Army maneuvers in 1910, predicted the military use of aircraft and the ensuing development and escalation of aerial combat in a submission to the UK Technical Subcommittee for Imperial Defence. 123, 124, missiles were dropped from an aeroplane for the first time. When United States Army Lieutenant Paul W. Beck dropped sandbags simulating bombs over Los Angeles, California. 125, aeroplanes were first used in warfare during the Italo-Turkish War of 1911-1912. The first operational use took place on the 23rd of October, 1911, when Captain Carlo Piazza made a flight near Benghazi in a Bluri at 11. The first aerial bombardment followed shortly afterwards on the 1st of November, when Second Lieutenant Giulio Gavotti dropped 4 bombs on 2 bases held by the Turks. The first photographic reconnaissance flight took place in March 1912, also flown by Captain Piazza. 126. Some types developed during this period would see military service into, or even throughout, World War I.